Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Today on the program, technology, how it is transforming human experience. I know that almost goes without saying, but here are 6 things that our guest today is going to talk about and how this is fundamentally being transformed. Face-to-face communication, hands-on knowledge, waiting, emotion, pleasure, and of course, connection to place, where we are and who we are. These are questions posed in a book that I cannot recommend highly enough. It's called The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World. Christine Rosen is a historian. She writes about technology matters, and this book, as I was just saying to her before we began, there's hundreds of books written on the issue of technology and our relationship to it and with it. But this actually really wrestles this down to the ground. So thank you, Christine, for doing this book and the hard work behind it. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate being on.
No, it's great. You write about this, and we all know it intuitively that experience is our first teacher, but the question you raise is what kind of person is formed when we live in this mediated, algorithmically governed world, right? Which it actually creates a different kind of human being.
Yes, I think what's changed and accelerated in recent years in particular are habits of mind and the way we go about our day-to-day behavior. So much more of it in recent years has become mediated. Now, it's mediated because we opt for convenience and the apps are helpful and it's easier to park if you have your parking app and whatnot. But what I found is that these experiences accumulate over time so that throughout the course of a day, so many things are mediated that we can no longer take for granted the fact that we'll speak to a stranger on the street, make eye contact in the grocery store, be thoughtful, civil, and patient with other drivers on the road, because we're not practicing those habits. These are things that skills that human beings used to be able to take for granted, but now we have to kind of actively practice and hopefully be aware that when they deteriorate or disappear.
I mean, we were headed down that road inevitably anyway with technology, but COVID and government's responses to it, and I know it's great to be the sort of, in hindsight, we're all geniuses here, but honestly, it was so rigid and so profound that we really did shut people off from all of those things, and it's much harder to come back.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of these trends for preferring the mediated interaction versus the face-to-face were already present, but COVID exacerbated it. And I think for a lot of people, they were surprised at how much they enjoyed not having to deal with other human beings. Look, people can be difficult. I live in a city. Not everybody's nice. Often people are rude. But right. Again, these are skills where part of the challenge in life is learning how to get along with others, learning how to share space, learning how to be patient. So what COVID taught a lot of people is that, wait a minute, I never have to leave my house. I can be entertained. I can do my job. I can have all my food delivered to me. I never have to interact or deal with other people. So what that means is that they fell out of practice. Here in the United States, we saw a lot of it in how people behaved on the roads. Once people started having to commute again and had to wait in traffic, tempers flared. People really had forgotten how to behave and how to be patient. So again, these trends were already developing, but I think the COVID lockdowns really exacerbated these trends and offered these options of doing things in a mediated way, particularly work life, that have not entirely gone back to normal.
It's way more problematic here than it is stateside. I mean, people, particularly government employees, are simply refusing to come back to work. They've created a life where they can, do yoga or drive the kids to school or whatever and count it all as a work day. But it's also making it really difficult for governments to function and services to be delivered and whatnot. But I'm thinking it's the same thing. They've had the comfort of being away from annoying coworkers and a boss looking over your shoulder saying, do some work.
Well, and what's interesting is that as anyone who has tried to corral a bunch of people and discuss a work issue via email versus
Right.
doing it in person where everybody's just standing in the same place, it's weirdly going to take you 2 or 3 times as long to do it via email because everyone's going to reply. There's the reply all guy, there's all the people who BCC you, and it becomes this bureaucratic morass in a way that, again, we are actually designed to deal with problems and deal with each other face to face. Are
Yeah.
we always pleasant? No, but we have a certain level of unspoken signaling and rules that help us cooperate, and also in the workplace help us be more creative as a team. So when you take people away from the workplace, they're also losing opportunities to improve, to come up with new ideas, to have those serendipitous moments that can only occur when you're sharing the same physical space.
It's so important. I mean, I grew up in newsrooms, and that was the whole point of us all being there before we went out to do whatever work it was going to do, or when we gathered at the end of the day, which is that feedback from others saying that's a crazy notion, or
Mhm.
I heard that from 6 people today. So there's reinforcement. When you lose all of that and you're living in this insular, often solo world, you don't have the sounding board. You don't
Mm.
have somebody rolling their eyes or laughing so that you're gauging what they really think.
Well, and it's interesting I interviewed a lot of people who train younger generations in jobs that are public facing.
Yeah,
Diplomacy is a good example. If you
right.
have any, and you know this as a public official, as a politician, all those soft skills matter a lot when you're negotiating, when you're meeting with foreign leaders in all these ways. Younger people who don't practice those skills because they spend so much time in mediated environments don't have them. And it becomes for them a very daunting thing to place a phone call to someone they don't know, to
Yeah.
walk up and introduce themselves. Now, this isn't true of an entire generation, and I do think. Look, I'm Gen X, and we always lament. I have Gen Z children. I'm like, oh, what's happening? Everything's going to hell
The
in a
next
handbasket.
generation, hell in a
Right, exactly.
handbasket.
So
Yeah,
I don't want to be an old woman shouting at clouds.
yeah,
However, there is a real skills deterioration if we don't practice. And so for kids who are raised, every time they're in public, someone puts an iPad or a phone in front of their
yeah,
faces. They're also not watching how the adults interact and how people smile or don't, or what it means if I cross my arms and look contemplative versus if I look angry. These are
yeah.
skills that have to develop over time, and we're robbing younger generations of the opportunities to practice them.
Yeah, when you think about how much monkey see, monkey do
Hmm.
is the teaching part
Right.
of parents to next gen, right? So that you're not just modeling behavior, you're actually showing it
Yes,
physically.
precisely. Yep.
I remember reading a study, and this was probably 20 or 25 years ago at least, about the brains that were being formulated of kids that were growing up in front of a television set, and how they could actually, at a much younger age than anybody thought, transmit what was clearly a two-dimensional image on a screen into their brain three-dimensionally so that they could then put the IKEA piece of furniture together or the toy. Um, and I'm wondering whether we're going more down that road or whether we're being stopped by it because we have so little real world, physical world, because the iPads become the babysitter and the friend and the constant companion.
Yes, it is worrisome. I mean, I remember the early days of television, people were very worried about how passive it made viewers, right?
Right.
You just sat and watched. There's a strange charm to that old school television watching now because at least people were sitting together in the same room staring at the same thing and had to get up to change the channel. So now we are uh, basically childhood is very screen based for lots and lots of kids. So what does that mean? That means they're not using their hands to explore the world. So their sense of embodied cognition, what they learn by doing, is very different. And it's an opportunity cost. There are only so many hours in the day. So if a child is spending 4 hours with an iPad and 1 hour outside scrambling around in their backyard or at a park,
Right.
that there's a cost to that, because that's a reversal from what maybe in my childhood, we would run around outside and then maybe we get an hour of television at night. So that
Yeah.
there's a trade-off there. And I think we've made the wrong balance. But the other thing that we've done is embrace new ways of doing things without seeing what we're losing by getting rid of the old. So handwriting is a perfect example of this. It
I
turns
love
out,
that bit in the
yeah.
book. I mean,
Well, so this all came out of the fact that when my kids were in elementary school, they weren't really learning how to write cursive. And I'm like, wait a minute. Well, is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? I started researching it. It's a bad thing because it turns out it's very important, obviously, to learn to write by hand. Both cognitively, it's implicated in memory formation and later literacy, but even cursive writing has a whole other layer in terms of our brain's ability to connect, and again, future literacy, memory retention, and all these fascinating studies where if you take notes by hand, you remember more than if you do it on a computer.
absolutely. Absolutely. I will just hold this up after all these years.
Ah, yay! That makes me so happy. It's
That
actually
is how
legible
I
handwriting.
think. I write cursively, but I think on paper this way, and I write it out. Um, you just used the phrase, and I want to come back to that for just a moment. Memory formation. It is important because you do retain it, but it has larger consequences than just, do I remember what's on this piece of paper? I mean, this is about how we embrace experience in the world as well. That if we're only looking at our experiences on Snapchat and they disappear after 30 seconds, then what?
Well, it's interesting because it really does implicate cultural memory too, and people's
Right.
sense of history, and the present and the future. And by that, I mean, most people now live most of their daily lives in the now. So they're responding immediately, both emotionally and rationally, and sometimes often irrationally, to what
Yeah.
they see in the moment, what comes across a stream, a feed. Everything on there is treated equally, whether it's a picture of a grandchild or a story about a natural disaster. And they're asked immediately to respond. Do you like, do you dislike, do you forward, do you, all of the things. So that habituates people to always be very hyper aware of what's happening in the moment. So what does that do for cultural memory? Well, people are less patient with the past. And by that, I mean, we don't want to go back and look at all of the things that we've done. Now, people read history books, for pleasure and whatnot. But in terms of what we teach, the skills we teach in schools, the habits of mind we're inculcating in kids, they'll go straight to Google to answer a question, not to a history book. And so what that means is that we are giving them a world that discounts the past in favor of the immediate, the on-demand, and the present. So then when they grow up and are asked to fix long-term, challenging, complicated problems, how are they going to do that? Do they have the skills to do that? It's not enough to just be able to Google an answer to a question. You have to know where to look. And Google does not contain all of the world's information, despite what it likes to market itself as doing. So
Well,
I
and
worry about that lack of historical sense in younger generations.
because even in the immediate, there's the lack of context, right? If you just want to know how high the building is, you can get that fact, or how many people were in the room. But if you don't know why they're there, or who built the building, or you don't understand how we came from point A to point B or C or D.
Well, and it encourages a kind of narcissistic approach to the world, which is, well, this building is this many feet high. How do I feel about it? Versus
Yeah.
who built it? What does it stand for? Where did it come from? What materials did it use? The kind of curiosity, the social media platforms in which a lot of people live their lives and through which they filter their experiences rewards personal emotional reactions over thoughtful, complicated, ambiguous examinations of problems. And it's designed that way. So again, if you check into your social media platform once a day, that's not going to change the way you think and
Right.
work. But most people spend most of their free hours and many of their work hours on these platforms.
Yeah. The thing that troubles me, and I guess I see this a lot in younger generations, just because they're so much more comfortable with the technology, but this whole selfie concept, which is, it's quite narcissistic. It's me eating this. It's me standing there. It's me, 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 me. And you combine that with the increasing trend that we see in the news business, the political world for sure, which is the spectacle. You know,
Mhm.
the crazier it is, that becomes the moment. The newscasts are actually calling it those things, you know, the
Mhm.
moment, and then they'll show a brawl in the Japanese legislature or some such thing, you know. So we've got those two forces, and it seems to me that those are very troubling forces that are really shaping way too much of our world right now.
Well, you're exactly right, because what it's doing is that it's encouraging institutions to conform to the demands of the platform versus the platforms integrating into the rules and regulations that the institution should inculcate. So what that means is if you have, say, a political institution, the people who get the most attention now are the ones who are the most performative and who cultivate followers on Instagram versus constituents in their district because they're rewarded for that. But for at an individual level, this constant demand to perform one's life and then the rewards that are immediately given to one for doing so, that really does impact one's sense of self. And developing a strong and healthy sense of self is an important part of life. It happens largely in childhood and early adolescence and early young adulthood. And we are seeing the effects of people who try to do that in the performative way. And we have a global mental health crisis among the young, anxiety, depression, because they are seeing themselves and filtering themselves through a platform that A, wasn't designed for children, but B, rewards some of the worst aspects of human nature, fear, anger, anxiety, piling on, sort of mob mentalities, rather than the better parts of human nature. And that leads to problems with character formation. That's why I do focus in the book a lot on habits of mind, daily behaviors, because I think we overlook those at our peril. When we change those basic building blocks of daily life, we change who we are because we are what we do on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's I think the profound message that you're getting here, not just this simple kind of, you know, technology is bad, put down your phone. It is we are creating a different kind of human being, and we're kind of now a product not of the human experience and the human condition, but the user experience of whatever piece of technology we're using.
Yes, and one of the things that does concern me going forward is that we can decide, especially as adults, we can choose to spend fewer hours staring at the
Yeah.
screen. But a lot of our cultural institutions, a lot of our political institutions, a lot of our lives are shaped by larger forces, and those forces are trying to conform to the demands of the machine. And by that I mean make us doubt a little bit our own human instincts. So you have apps that can register your heart rate and various other behavioral tics to tell you how you're feeling when you're in the presence of other people who maybe you think you like this person, but the app's like, no, 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 your heart rate's up. They're actually bad for you. And then people justify cutting that person. That's a toxic person in my life. The app told me so. And people genuinely are find these sorts of things appealing because they haven't learned to trust their own judgment or haven't cultivated their own judgment. And that's a future that gives a lot of power and a lot of personal information to companies and potentially to governments that really shouldn't have that kind of power over its own citizens and over consumers.
Because that is what we are seeing. We're seeing it in this country in spades, that the answer to all of this is to censor,
Mm-hmm.
is to, you know, prohibit access to all the technology in schools. I have sort of mixed views about that because I don't think if you're in grade 3 you need to sit on your phone every day. But then that extension, we're seeing it now in my world where should be able to choose what I watch and what I read and when I want to do that, and I have governments telling me that I shouldn't do that and that I need to watch more Canadian programming as opposed to American programming. Maybe that's not my choice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm looking for a certain kind of experience or relevancy to my life. And that's where I fear this is headed, is censorship and control
Mm-hmm.
rather than engagement and understanding about
Well,
what the impact is.
This is a really important point you raise, because if you think about what a lot of these technologies of convenience and connection habituate us to expect in life, a huge part of it is an expectation that we will be surveyed. We're going to be looked at and watched. Now, most of the time, it's probably by businesses that want to sell us stuff. So we think, we've that ship has sailed. But
Yeah.
now, increasingly, it's health insurance companies, it's governments, local and federal, and in the case of hostile foreign powers, it's hostile foreign powers trying
Right.
to spy on the citizens of other countries. So but what makes us blasé about it is again, we've embraced a world where we'll trade privacy, individuality, and freedom for convenience. And that is where I think we do need to think through where we want to unravel some of those habits, because they're leading us down a path where, as you say, it softens the ground, so that when a government does say, this is misinformation, we've decided this is misinformation, you
Mhm.
can't have access to it. A lot of people will shrug and say, "Oh, okay, because information's so complicated, there's so much of it. I guess I'll trust this administration to tell me." As we found here in the U.S. during COVID, that led to people's perfectly legitimate, true views being censored by the government. We have a First Amendment that was an unconstitutional act, and now people are sort of, I think, much more skeptical about those
Yeah.
claims. But they don't have another way of going about assessing truth claims. So there's a real churn in that information ecosystem. But again, we've become habituated to believing what Google throws up on search results and not questioning what isn't on the menu. What are they not showing us? What is it that they're censoring, even as a company that has an impact? And that's true of social media companies too.
Well, I mean, we learned through the Twitter files and other things that
Yes.
this was considered sort of normal, that government would call in the high-tech companies and say, look, we don't want the stuff that disagrees with us or criticizes us
Exactly.
rising to the top of the pile. Fix that with your algorithm, right?
Bury it on page 4, as they say, right?
And people complied. I mean,
Yes, they did.
it's very frightening. So there's been some exposure of to that, but it's not clear to me how we really change that, because we still don't know what the algorithms are putting forward for us to see, and why your feed looks different than my feed, and why is that?
Mm-hmm. Well, the transparency aspect of it is going to be the really difficult challenge. And
Yeah,
Europe has taken one approach with a lot of heavy-handed regulation. In the
yeah.
U.S., obviously, we don't do that. But when I teach classes on technology and ethics, I often make the students who come from all around do a search of a same term, and then
Mhm.
everybody describe what they get, and it's all different because it's all algorithmically curated, and they are shocked because it's a basic factual question. They're like, what do you mean Google just doesn't give us all the same answer? I was like, of course not. They are shaping your worldview. They are, and again, it's not deliberate in the sense that they're trying to target individual people.
No, they're responding to your behavior.
Exactly.
You
And
know.
they're feeding you more of the same too. So
Yeah.
it's a very narrowing and homogenizing way of understanding your world. And TikTok is the most egregious offender in this regard. It curates something so that once you spend even a split second longer on one video over another, you're going to get a lot more of the same thing. And if that's cute kittens and puppies frolicking in a field, that's great. But if it's propagandistic videos from a foreign country, that's not good for a
Yeah.
12-year-old or a 13-year-old to be watching.
That's the thing. What do you make of restricting access beyond parents making these decisions about, like our parents used to do, is you can have an hour of TV if you play outside, that
Right.
kind of stuff. But what's your reaction to, say, a school saying no phones, no phones, put them down at 8:30 when you get here, we'll give them back at 4.
So if you'd asked me this question 5, even 10 years ago, I would have said, it's really the parents. We don't want the government meddling in what's a parent's
Right.
role. But I've changed my mind in 2 ways. One, I do think social media platforms should have an age limit, like a gated, it should be gated by age, because these were designed for use by adults. I don't think a 9-year-old has any business being on Instagram. And there's just no reason for a kid that age to spend time on a social media site designed for adults, even with the parental controls that they claim to have put into place under pressure from parents and potential litigation.
Yeah.
There's always been an age limit, and in the US, we just haven't enforced it. So we do have legislation moving through our Congress now that would actually put a little bit of teeth into the 16 or 14-year-old
Yeah.
age limit. I think
It's
that's
here
good.
too.
For schools, I actually like the bell to bell, no smartphone policy for two reasons. One, it takes the distraction away from the kids, and a lot of bullying and bad stuff happens on those phones during school hours too. But the teachers love it also because the teachers don't have to compete with the phone for their kids' attention in the classroom. And it's impossible to compete with a smartphone if you're a teacher. So the fact that it's actually the parents who are often the sticklers here because they want to monitor and survey their kids throughout the day and be in touch with their kids throughout the day. They claim it's for safety, but
Yeah,
it's not
helicopter
necessarily
parents.
healthy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I've become a fan, but for schools, I think that's each community. The best policies are the ones that come from the bottom up. Organically, communities are like, you know what, this isn't working. We need to rethink our use of technology. And the schools that have done that have had where parents buy in and teachers buy in. Definitely your teenagers are not going to buy in, but they don't get to choose. This is what's about the parents and the teachers and the community decide together. That works. And we've seen some really compelling results from those experiments so far.
But when you take it to the next level of adult, then that's when it becomes a problem.
That's when I become pretty libertarian in terms of what I want the federal government telling me to do. I think that's where educating people to teach them about the potential harms and getting them to think about their own choices. And again, because I'm a conservative, I don't think the first answer to any question is ever going to be the federal government.
Right.
So I don't want to see a lot of regulation and stifling of innovation. I do, however, think we should have, as consumers and as citizens, many of these companies are American companies. They ought to live by American values. They ought to be more transparent with their data. They ought to be held before Congress if their product harms children. I support all that. That's how our system works. But as adults, we make choices for ourselves, and I certainly don't think the government should be in the business of censoring information or shaping it in any way to help one political party versus the other. Yeah. And we as adults should live with the consequences of our choices.
I mean, we're seeing the market kind of self-select anyway, and it's not a positive thing. But I mean, you're in the world either a Fox viewer or an MSNBC viewer, right? And so everybody's increasingly off in their echo chambers, and then coming back to this phone in front of them to search the other sources. But that's a lot of work if you become your own news gathering and editing force, right? And most people who have jobs don't have time.
Well, and what's interesting now is that the most pernicious thing in terms of political polarization isn't just that people tend to be in an echo chamber, but it's also that we've grown so far apart in those chambers that there's no shared reality. Yeah. And people will have their own sets of facts too. And they'll be like, well, I did my research and here's why you're wrong and I'm right. And in democracies, you have to be able to have some very slim bit of shared reality, agreed upon principles, ideas. You don't have to agree with everyone else in terms of their politics, but we've got to get along. And I worry about the fracturing of that reality, because if you spend most of your time online, you are in a kind of reality, but it is not grounded. It is not based in the way that I think the founding fathers of the United States imagined a public square to be. So that's where I think the digital public square is not a substitution for the actual public square.
This is, I'm, as many people have read Robert Putnam over the years, right? And his bowling alone theory. And I mean, for those that don't know, but it's pretty simple. His theory was more people across America were bowling, but they just weren't doing it in bowling leagues. And then that became a metaphor for life itself, which is true enough. But that kind of, and you were just talking about this civil engagement or lack thereof, or inattention to what is going on in the world around us, versus civic disengagement, saying that, no, I don't want to be with people. I don't want to be with people that I disagree with. I don't want to be with people in general. Like, that is really breaking down beyond kind of the bowling alone.
No, it is. And that trend of bowling alone, which was, he looked into isolation and loneliness, the lack of civic organizations and voluntary organizations in particular in the
Right.
20th century. I think in the 21st century, where we're moving is the few remaining what sociologists call third places, not home, not work, but like a tavern or a park or places in public that anyone can come and enjoy, and where you might brush up against people who you don't know, who aren't like you, from different classes, different backgrounds. Those are good, and healthy societies have a lot of those and cultivate those because it gives people a place to, be themselves, but in public in a way that isn't tied to their family or their work obligations and identities. Those places, the few we have all been colonized by technology. They're all Wi-Fi hotspots now. Everybody just goes, sits down, opens their phone or their computer. So it doesn't matter. You're in a nice coffee shop. Nobody's actually having those spontaneous interactions. They're in their own worlds. They have a bubble that they can create with their digital existence, and they can take it everywhere. So again, the deterioration of third places generally is now they're truly under siege. We have to actively choose to eject technology from them. In my neighborhood, cafe opened, and I live near a university, so this was a very shocking move. The cafe owner said no laptops.
Yeah.
Because he wanted people, he's like, you can read a book, you can have your phone, but I don't want to, this isn't a WeWork space or an office space.
Yes.
It's a cafe. So at first people were angry, but the down the block there's another, like a Starbucks, and everybody's on their computer.
So go there.
What a different, just the whole experience of being in that place. It's a much more human place as a result. It's really fascinating to see just what that one ejection of one technology can do to transform a public space.
Well, even Starbucks, I think we saw it kind of went to drive-throughs during COVID. Mm-hmm. Pardon me. But also did so because they weren't a free workspace, right?
That's right.
And people were buying one cup of coffee and staying for 6 hours.
Yeah. Or now, I live in Washington, D.C. Yeah. Many of the Starbucks now, if you're a human being in the Starbucks, you're kind of an anomaly in many neighborhoods because it's just a steady stream of people coming in and picking up their mobile orders. They don't look or talk to anyone else. They just come in, they get their mobile order, off they go. So again, we've put this layer of technology for the sake of convenience between any human being and another human being they might just briefly make eye contact with and say thank you when you hand them their coffee.
Right.
It's kind of fascinating to see how we've transformed those spaces in a short span of time.
Your phrase in the book about this, which is the serendipity of experience, which is what has given so many of us our best moments in life. Yes. You're halfway around the world and you run into somebody from your hometown, or you end up going out to dinner with complete strangers because they've invited you because you're sitting by yours. We're losing all those serendipitous moments with this, not only lack of access, but our refusal to participate.
Yes. And so the technology companies, and in fact, I think when he was at Google, Eric Schmidt actually used this phrase. He said, oh, we can manufacture serendipity now, which you cannot. No, true serendipity is not, you cannot manufacture. But what you're speaking to, I think, is, again, this is a deeply felt human need, an openness to experience. So it's very nerve-wracking to be by yourself alone in a strange place, right? That's why, but we travel for that sense of risk and adventure and the reward it brings when we feel like we've mastered a place. Now we don't ever have to take the risk, in the sense that we can always keep everyone with us right there on our phone. And so, but what that does, it gives us the convenience and the ease, but it takes away the opportunity to discover something new. And it shuts us out from the people around us in a way that sends them a very clear message too, which is this person is not available to interact with me. So it is again, these are all really subtle things and we don't really think about it. And it wouldn't matter if it was only happening here and there, but it is actually how we live most of the time now.
You combine that fact with I don't know, just the selfie culture that we were talking about, and you also end up with the bystander effect, that even when we are out there with our phones, we're not reacting in the way that normally human beings would if we see a problem. If the child falls, you go and help them up. You help them, you make them understand that they're, this scrape on their knee is not the end of the world, and you take 30 seconds, or helping an elderly person across the street. Now it's on the cell phone, and then if it turns to mayhem, we still don't engage.
Yeah, this has been a really transformative thing in terms of public space when things go wrong in public space. Jane Jacobs used to talk about eyes on
Yeah.
the street, people who were just kind of around in the neighborhood, knew what's what, could notice trouble maybe before it started or got too bad.
Right.
And we are all supposed to have an active responsibility in public space to others. And that we've eliminated. And what we've done instead is all become kind of almost like paparazzi, in the sense that if a fight breaks out, you're just as likely to see people pull out a phone and start filming it and then uploading it to YouTube or some other website than you are to see them intervene at all
Yeah.
or call 911. If you talk to law enforcement, I've talked to lots of cops about this. They're like, "Oh, they won't." I was like, "Well, they have their phone. I mean, at least they call 911." He's like,
Right.
"No, they're filming it." But in filming it, you take yourself, you're sort of abdicating responsibility, but you still feel like you're doing something. And I think that's the weird power the phone gives people, is a sense of, well, maybe you actually physically can't get involved because you're not physically able to take down someone who's attacking someone else, but you
Right.
could call for help. And
Yeah.
that's the point we're at now, where a lot of people don't even take that step. They just are observers of what's happening right in front of them. They film it. They feel like that's doing something. And meanwhile, someone's getting injured or harmed. So look, I mean, filming stuff as citizens can also bring about reform and change. And,
Yeah.
we can document things that might otherwise not be documented. So I don't want to go too far in the other direction here. But the impulse to be a bystander is strong enough in human nature. And I think the phones exacerbate that tendency in ways that are harmful.
Well, and again, it doesn't offer that context. So there they are with their phone recording this event, and it's the first thing up on the net, and
Mhm.
everybody's decided that it was the bad cop doing something to the
Right.
the good protester, whatever the situation might be, not knowing that 30 seconds earlier, the protester had pulled a knife on whatever it may
Exactly.
be. So
Right.
we're losing the facts and we're
Hmm.
losing the context for all of that, which is kind of an additional sin
That's right. That's right.
on top of the bystander. I got to the end of the book, and honestly, I'm just going to hold this up again because the cover is also really beautiful. The Extinction of Experience Being Human in a Disembodied World. And we've had Christine Rosen with us. But right toward the end of the book, you start to write about a fellow by the name of Ray Kurzweil. And when I was doing a television program years ago, we put him on the air and did an interview with him, and I found him fascinating. But the reaction was, this man is insane. He was talking about the ability to, if we could only download our brains, and this is like all this technology, remember, but if we could download our brains, we would live forever.
Hmm.
I don't know what you call that theory of the
The
world, but
singularity, right? Isn't that his thing? Like the singularity. We'll all upload our consciousness. And so we will no
and
longer need our physical bodies because our minds will
right,
just be in one huge hive, I guess.
yes. So he wasn't as crazy today as it seemed then, just
Yeah.
because of what we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes.
Well, he represents something really interesting because he hasn't changed, as you say. Like
Yeah.
he still has the same crazy theories, which have not yet, thankfully, come to fruition. In fact, I think he had to update his book, like almost the singularity. It's
Yes,
still
yes,
coming.
yes.
It's like the cult leader. They're like the asteroid's going to hit. It's just I
Yeah. It's just
miscalculated.
going to be later. Yeah.
Right. But he represents what I think is the most dangerous trend in our technologist worldview, the sort of engineering mindset. And that's a lack of humility about human limits, physical limits, cognitive limits, social limits. Actually, we're not designed to be friends with millions of people, that we're designed to actually live in smaller communities and have both rewards from those communities and responsibilities for them. And what I think the internet did is promise a version of that would scale up, but actually
Mhm.
some of these human relationships aren't scalable and shouldn't be. His lack of humility about lifespan, for example, is shared by a lot of people in Silicon Valley. There are lots of life extension technologies. There are already companies right now that will take the voice of your dead loved one and turn it into an AI fueled chatbot so you can talk with your dead friend. Is that good for us? Well, if you're really
I don't
lonely and
think
not able to
so.
grieve and move past your grief, maybe not. And also, the idea that any one of us could consent to the use of our words and our voices after we're gone. And so there's a whole new horizon where, again, there are some people who think they can cheat death and cheat human limits. And it shows a lack of humility, and it disrespects what kind of makes us great about being human, which is that we are finite. We are kind of weird and quirky, and it wants to flatten out all those things and make them manageable and measurable and efficient. And I think that makes us less interesting as human beings, ultimately.
The consequences of the extinction of experience. It's really been a wonderful conversation. I want to talk to you about all of the other things you write about the end of mainstream media, what the Democrats did wrong, why,
I have
um,
thoughts.
yeah, you have thoughts. I've got a desk full of stuff. We'll do that another day because it's
Okay.
what you've seen in terms of what went on in the election and all of that. It's
Hmm.
most fascinating. But we're going to leave it with the book today, Being Human in a Disembodied World: The Extinction of Experience. Christine Rosen, culture writer, critic, political thinker, teacher, and of course author. So really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to
Great,
you.
Christine. We'll talk soon. And we'll talk with you again very soon on another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen.